why don't you take your seats? Thank you so much. And can I invite you, if you don't mind, to be awfully British and awfully welcoming and awfully polite by giving Jonny Thiessen a round of applause as he comes to join me here this evening. So I promised you earlier on that I would give you a mobile number. If you have some questions that you'd like me to put to Jonathan as you go through the course of the next 25 minutes or so, and you're not a person that likes to ask things out loud, take this number down. It's 07543 839 279. I'll give you that again for those of you that are writing it down on a phone or on a bit of paper. 07543 839 279. If you're watching at home, you can also participate by sending us these messages. 07543 839 279. Or you can use my Twitter handle to send a message. That's at Malcolm J. Duncan. Malcolm has two L's. M-A-L-C-O-L-M, J. Duncan. Or my Facebook page, which is Rev Malcolm Duncan. Do you have a Twitter handle if people want to follow you and continue this conversation after tonight?
I don't, actually. For security reasons, I've stayed off of a lot of social media.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So, great. So if you want to channel any questions to Jonathan, then that's the way to do it. Through the Twitter feed, the Facebook page, or that mobile number, 07543 839 279. Jonathan, for those that don't know you watching online, and we have a number of people that watch online as well on a Sunday night and a Sunday all day, who are you? Where are you from? And what are you doing now?
Great. All in 30 seconds. Yeah, so I joined the Gold Hill family just over 10 years ago. I was fortunate and blessed to meet Fiona. Was then Bardsley, part of the Bardsley family that used to work at WEC and was involved here. Fiona and I met and married here at Gold Hill. Well, it'll be nearly 11 years ago now. We then went and we joined OM and spent the next 6 years as a family in Russia. And we're involved in various things there, and the church was very, just came around us. Malcolm and Debbie came out, and others came out in building teams, and so we were very blessed and felt like that was a really great connection with the church. 3 years ago, we took I was asked to take a role at the OM USA headquarters just outside of Atlanta, and so I was in that role for just over a year, and then was asked to come in and lead a new initiative focused on mobilizing marketplace professionals into God's global mission.
And family, how many Thiessenettes are there?
Yeah, so we've got 3. Kaylee, who's 8 years old, Liam, who's 6, and Aiden is 4.
So managing, because you do a lot of international travel, don't you? You're kind of flying all over the world now. Managing all of that on top of making sure that you're a good dad and that you're looking after yourself, and you're looking really well, by the way, is a bit of a challenge. How do you manage that? Before we get to talk about the stuff that we're going to talk about, what's your rhythm like? What's your kind of balance and blend like, Jonny?
I knew there'd be a curveball question in there somewhere. That's an American term, by the way. I just realized.
From a Canadian.
From a Canadian, there we go, yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a constant conversation between Fiona and myself, and asking others to speak into that who have more experience. The challenge is that you feel like you've just reached a place of equilibrium with some rhythm, and the kids' ages change and school changes, and things need to shift again. So I think the thing we do most, I think the thing that we focus on is just open communication and continuing to talk about it. I think for me personally, one of the things I've realized is that when I'm traveling, obviously I'm not present, but when I am around, I try and be fully present for my family, which means a lot of evenings or weekends completely switching off and allowing my family to have, my kids to have all of me.
Where Jonathan and Fiona live in a Tyrone in Atlanta. Being an Irishman, the fact that he lives in Tyrone is a real encouragement to me. They have a lake at the very back of their house. Matthew and I had the privilege of spending some time with them last year as we were doing some other things as well. And knowing your heart, Jonathan, knowing who you are, not just what you do, but knowing who you are and loving you very much, I know that you will constantly be listening to God about how to make sure that your balance and your blend is right. And I also know you won't get it right all the time. But I know your heart is too. And I've no doubt that as you seek to put God first, he'll guide you in all of that. I want to read two scriptures that will kind of ground our conversation, if that's okay. And they might seem disconnected to you, but I think they're pretty important. The first one is from the story of King David, an Old Testament king of Israel, in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, who is working out how strong his army is. And we read this in verse 32. Of Issachar, those who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do, 200 chiefs and all their kindred under their command. As he's numbering his army, he comes to this group called the people or the men of Issachar, who understand the times and know what to do. We've touched on that verse a couple of times in the last few weeks here at Gold Hill. The second verse is another verse that we've looked at and explored as a church family a little bit. And it's Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it, as done for the Lord and not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ. Jonathan, a lot of people in Christian circles talk about mission. And when we talk about mission or missionaries or serving God, we have this fabulous picture of somebody who's living in a mud hut, never having had running water for 40 years, sacrificing everything and living out of communication. And if we're not careful, that becomes the model or the pinnacle of what it means to be a missionary and serving Jesus. And whilst that is a beautiful and challenging picture, I want to start our conversation by asking you, has the church's traditional understanding of what it means to be a missionary been effective in the way that it could have been?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my friend wrote an article called "The Curse of the Missionary Biography." And as someone who grew up reading these voraciously, and biographies that inspired me and informed my life, I look at them with, from two sides, and I see that obviously the stories of what God did in the past through heroes of the faith and through many stories that we don't even know are incredible, and were incredible in their times. I think that, going back to the first verse in 1 Chronicles, I think however, it's absolutely imperative that we understand what's happening under our watch in history. And when we look at the world today, we see, for example, that our mission activities, and take multiple mission organizations who have been doing a number of studies over the last number of years. The studies now show that we are not penetrating the vast majority of communities and workplaces in the world. The reality is that nearly 9 out of 10 Muslims will never even meet a Christian in their lifetime. And yet we know that the number one reason a Muslim comes to faith is by observing the life of another believer. And so the world has changed in so many different ways. One of the massive changes geopolitically is the restriction of visas. Over 80% of the world now live in countries where any kind of overt missionary activity is severely restricted or entirely illegal. And so that wasn't the case. The world looked very different when most mission agencies like OM and others were founded 50, 60 years ago. And so, like the men of Issachar, I think it's imperative that we look at the world today and we say, what's changed? And what does that mean about how we engage the world around us. We do that in business, we do that in education, we do that in every other sector. But sometimes we're a lot slower to do that within church and mission. One of the encouraging, on the flip side, one of the encouraging things that we're seeing is that, we talk about unreached, unengaged people groups, and many of the rapidly emerging market opportunities in the world today overlap significantly with where we're seeing unengaged, unreached people groups in the world. And so in God's bigger providence, we don't think it's not a coincidence. God is at work. While certain things are changing and are making our efforts more challenging, other opportunities are actually opening up. And we're seeing a generation that's ready and willing to go. Over 70% of millennials in the U.S. say that they expect to take their career overseas at some point in their lives.
So one of the challenging things that you've just said, I think the most challenging thing I've just heard you say, is that 9 out of 10 Muslims will not meet a Christian. Am I right in saying that the global trend is that in terms of percentage, we are reaching less of the world now than we were reaching 20 years ago?
Yeah. So when OM was founded in 1958, there were, George Brewer at that time and other mission leaders were talking about 1.5 billion people in the world who...
Do you want to use that one? Because yours is going in and out a little bit. Great.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah, go ahead.
We're talking about 1.5 billion people in the world who were considered unreached. These were people who would be born, live, and die without ever having the chance of hearing the good news of Jesus. That number today is anywhere between 2.8 and 3 billion. And so the Gordon Conwell University in the U.S. recently put out its latest research to show that we're going backwards at the rate of 57,000 people a day who are being added to the number of the unreached. And that's not to take away from all the great stories of what God is doing around the world. I mean, we're seeing movements of Muslim people groups in every house of Islam around the world coming to faith. Incredible things that we've never seen before in history. But the reality is that population growth is exploding in certain areas, and we're not managing to penetrate those areas. And the other reality is that as mission agencies, we're sending more and more people to the same places rather than into the places where people actually live and work.
So I want to pause for a minute and think about how this all connects to us sitting here tonight or listening online. Because you are a classic missionary.
Yeah.
You are one of the ones that that gave up everything. When Jonny says that he lived in Russia, he lived in Siberia. And when we went to see him, it was minus 47. And he and Fee were living in difficult circumstances for many years. Then God provided them with a new home. And ask him to tell you a story of one particular moment in his life when he was thrown into a bath thinking that that was his last few moments. So you're a classic missionary, and yet what you've given your life to, the methodology wasn't working. So you've now begun to explore a different way of reaching people with the good news of Jesus. So there's a whole paradigm shift in your head that I think people need to understand is a difficult thing. What drove you to make that shift?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. One for me, I'm a numbers person, so I see things. I see the world in numbers. Not everyone does, and that's okay, and that's great. But I found it hard when I recognized that I was part of a missions model that in and of itself, it's honoring to God and it's glorifying to Him. And God has used the current model of seeing people raise support and go to the nations in incredible ways. I'm not taking away from that. But the reality is that we're not keeping pace. And I got to a point where I said, I cannot give my life to something that's losing ground. I cannot live with the fact that by the time I die, more people in the world will never have heard of Jesus than when I was born. It can't be business as usual. We've got to try something. It may not work. We may not be successful, but we can't live life business as usual. And so I was really gripped by just the reality, the stark reality. If we were a business, if missions was a business, we would look at the numbers and we'd say, we're losing money every single year. Something's got to change. The board of directors would call us in and say, guys, you got to try something different. And then I think the second thing for me was really you challenged me on this a number of years ago. You said, who are you reading on some of the history of thinking around faith and work and vocation? So I've been doing a lot of reading on some of the history, the church history, and I don't want to make this sound like this is just my journey. There's a whole group of us, and actually a number of movements in the U.S. who are all involved in the same thing, and we're feeding off of each other and learning from each other. But I was reading Os Guinness's book, The Call, and Oz is a real someone that I look up to very highly. And he writes about what he calls the fallacy of the current, or of the contemporary Protestant term, full-time Christian service, right? And he says, where did this come from? As though those not serving in the church or in a Christian organization are only in the part-time service of Christ. That can't be true. And he goes back into church history and he looks at the character of Eusebius of Caesarea, who was one of the prominent church historians in the 4th century. And Eusebius talks about this. He says, he writes about Christ giving the church 2 ways of life. He says Christ has given the church the perfect way of life and the permitted way of life. And so if you engage as a monk or a nun or a priest in the contemplative practices, church practices, you are then entering into the perfect way of life. Anything else, any other secular profession was seen as the permitted way. So if you were in governing or trades or farming or raising a family. And then Eusebius says this. He says, these have a kind of secondary grade of piety, right? And so that's where you see the beginning of this almost a spiritual caste system, where you have those who are elevated to special supernatural status in the church, and the rest of the church are demoted to being participants or being spectators, not the participants but the spectators in what God is doing. And it's not until Luther comes around and Luther says, no, and he has this amazing quote where he says the works of the priests and the monks differ, however holy and arduous, differ not one whit in the sight of God from the works of the rustic laborer in the fields. And he even says something like, God and angels smile when man changes a diaper. Not something you'd expect Luther to say, but I think a lot of women probably smile as well. But he really takes on this whole idea of 2 grades, 2 classes of society, and says, no, the whole church is involved in the mission of God, Missio Dei.
So that's important for us, I think. And it's important, what you said just a moment or two ago, why would you give your life to something that's losing ground? I think the church in the UK, and I think the church in South Buckinghamshire, and I think the church in this village, we've got to ask that question. There are a lot of people that are desperate to be engaged as Christians in making a difference in their community and society. But the model that we've got isn't cutting it. It's not cutting it here. It's not cutting it in the nation. There might be pockets of revival and renewal and awakening, but there's something more strategic that we have to do if we want to see our communities transformed. And all of us want to see our communities transformed. And most of you that are Christians will recognize that the way we're doing that is okay, but it's not making the massive difference that we want to see. We feel like we're putting money in our pockets, in the words of Haggai, with holes in them. We've sown much and harvested little. But, and it's a huge but, your answer, not your answer, but the answer that God seems to be pressing into so many people around the world, from the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity to Operation Mobilization to organizations working in Scotland around releasing people, is about helping the whole body of Christ, everybody in this room, from the youngest person to the oldest person, everybody watching online, to understand that we are Christ's ministers, that there's something we can do with our lives that can advance the kingdom. All of us Every single one of us, builders, nurses, labourers, doctors, pastors, preachers, students, all of us can do something. What is that?
Yeah, no, that's right. And this is, I couldn't count the number of conversations we have, especially with university-age students, so those studying or coming out of university. And just talking recently, a young man saying, you know, I'm an engineer, my wife's a teacher, and hey, look, we could get the same job, and he gives a particularly difficult part of the world that they were focusing on. We could get the same job in this part of the world as we could back home. And so would it be okay if we just did that? Would it be okay if we just took our job there? And then he said, I don't know if it counts. I don't know if it counts as mission, but we could do this, and we could share our faith and our life with people. And so a big part of what we're doing is we're saying to people, yes, you count. In the mission of God, you're taking who God has created you to be, uniquely designed you, fashioned you to be. And he didn't make a mistake when before creation, according to Ephesians 1, he came up with this design. He didn't make a mistake. He knew that one day you would go on to study these things and your heart would be filled with a desire to live this out. And he gave you these for a reason, and that reason was to be used for his purposes. And so as you're doing that and you're crossing cultures and you're going to another part of the world to see disciples made, you count in the mission of God. In fact, if you stay here and you live that out, you count in the mission of God. And so a big part of what we feel God has put on our hearts is just to engage the hearts and minds of people with this idea that you count. And to give permission, as silly as it sounds. Why should we be the ones to give permission? But it's like for so long people have been told that to be in ministry looks like this. It means giving up what God has created you to do and going off and doing something else and calling that ministry. I look at my own life, and I always wanted to be a doctor. When I grew up, I told people I would be a doctor until I was 16 years old. And I had a strong sense of God calling me into some sort of international mission work. And unfortunately, at that time, and God's goodness is real, and he's able to redeem our shortcomings, but I understood that to mean that I had to give up that dream. And I look at it now and I think, who has the keys to any kingdom, any community, any workplace, any country in the world? It's people in healthcare, people in education, people in finance, people in IT. It's all of these things. And if I had that, what could God have done through my life? Again, God is able to redeem. But I think there's so many people in the church who are waiting to hear that message, that God can use you and will use you.
I think there's a genuineness about that which is so urgent, because very often when I hear people preaching, all of their illustrations, all of their stories, all of their encouragements are about ministries that are run by the church, about the church youth group, about the church seniors ministry, about the church prayer ministry, about the church preaching team, about the church parent and toddlers. And the examples that they hold up are often pastors and missionaries that have gone off and done different things. But actually, what if God has called you where you are? What if your everyday choices are the holiest things that you have? And what if some of you have already counted yourselves out of God's purposes by saying, well, I'm going to settle down, get married and have kids, buy a nice house, make sure that they've got a nice garden, get them to a private school, and yet God might have more for you. It might be that there are some of you here back from university and you're thinking, well, what am I going to do when I finish? And maybe God has you here. Maybe he's fashioning callings and he wants you to be the engineer that you can be, but in Oman or in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia. And what if he wants you to be that here in South Buckinghamshire? What if he wants to take your skills and your experiences and your professional lives, or take you as a grandmother or as a grandfather, and you're about to enter the most exciting season of your life? How does Scatter Global, which is the initiative's name, work?
Yeah, so our hope is that our focus within Scatter Global is to say, how can we engage the 99% of the church that have somehow felt disconnected with mission? How can we engage their hearts and minds? How can we connect them? We want to connect them with others who are living this out, to share the stories that we often don't hear today, to inspire them about what's possible, to connect them to other organizations who offer training materials and resources for people to go out and do this, and then to connect them with real live job opportunities in certain parts of the world.
So one is about equipping and the other is about acting as almost like a recruitment agency.
Almost like a monster.com for Christian professionals.
Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah. And so as people come into the community, and we're in the beta phase of getting this up and running, so we're still working through what this all looks like. But what we're saying to people is, tell us who you are, tell us what industry you're in, tell us how many years of experience you have, when you'd be ready to go, and we would love to connect you to others like you in the same fields, working abroad. We would love to connect you to resources, help you create a plan for engaging yourself in some sort of a next step. But then we also love to connect you to live job opportunities.
So do you have are there any particular, I don't know whether this is the right word or not, are there any particular target countries or regions globally that you're trying to get these recruitment opportunities gathered together under your radar so that you can connect?
Yes, yeah, so we had to focus on something to start with, and so we're focusing on the Arabian Peninsula, and so we've got a number of countries within that we are focusing on specifically. And if you go onto Scatter Global, you can if you go onto the jobs
What's
tab,
the
you'll
website?
see scatterglobal.com.
Okay. And I guess what's exciting for me as a pastor is there are two things that are exciting about it. There's loads of stuff that's exciting about it, to be honest. But there are two very exciting things for me. The first, it might sound counterintuitive. Sometimes you hear churches say, well, if we let all our people go, we'll have nobody left. I don't think that will be an issue. I think if you, as a pastor, release people to what God has for them, you can't outgive God, and he gives you back, pressed down, shaken together, and flowing over. So I would look across this room and across our church family of several hundred people, and I'd be thinking, oh, I really pray that you listen to what God might want you to do in this next chapter, because it could be the most exciting chapter of your life. Maybe you are going to have the opportunity to experience another culture. Maybe some of you are going to go to work in Greece or Turkey or the Arabian Peninsula or Southeast Asia or somewhere. Do it, do it, do it. But secondly, I get really excited about the idea that for our congregation, I think my job as a pastor is to help people to follow Jesus more closely and faithfully through the teaching of Scripture and loving people. I think that's my job. And if God has called you to be a disciple of Jesus, then surely what you do with the vast majority of your time is one of the most important questions that you can answer. And I always remember meeting a girl, years ago, that worked in Tesco. She hated it. I mean, she really hated it. And you could tell by the way she served you that she hated it. You know, if you were giving her something, she'd kind of throw it through the scanner. You were glad that your eggs didn't break as a result. And I remember one week having a conversation with her. She was a Christian. She was in the church that I was leading, which wasn't great. And I said, why is it you're so miserable? And she said, because how can I be of any use to God here? I have dreams of doing loads of other things. And I can remember saying to her, unless you can serve God where you are, you're never going to serve him where you're not. So what Scatter Global also does, I think, and why it and other initiatives like it are a gift to the church, is it helps us to realize that what we're doing today matters. That your ministry as a nurse in the surgery, or as making a cup of coffee in a coffee shop, or helping people across the road, whatever it is an act of worship. And that's where this Colossians 3 thing comes up. Do people get that or not?
I think more and more they do, and I think there's something special that's been maybe embedded, especially within this generation, and not to say that it can't be found elsewhere, but this desire for authenticity in everything that I do. I want to be authentic to who I really am. Now there's downside, there's flip sides to that, but I think we're seeing there's an interest in living out my life well for a purpose. I want my life to count for something. And even you see this even outside of Christian circles, the Ivy League schools in the US, you're seeing a huge number, a huge increase of people joining the Peace Corps, Teach for America, when they have great opportunities to do something with huge salaries. But they want their life to count for something. They want to give their lives wholly, fully to something. So I think God's embedding that in this generation. And I think it goes back to the story of Daniel in Scripture, and just looking at how Daniel he went to the King's University, was initially kidnapped and taken to this foreign land, but sent to the King's University for 3 years. And when he came out, he was found to be 10 times better in all manner of wisdom and knowledge than his peers. And so Daniel, someone who could have said, no, I'm not going to study this heathen pagan philosophy. I'm not going to align myself with this kingdom. Instead, he comes out and he says, no, I'm going to do the very best I can do, be the best I can be at where God has placed me in this time. And God takes that attitude, that approach, and elevates Daniel to a position of incredible influence where he changes the civilization. And so we never know when we're faithful in what God has done. It may be our second choice life, but when we're faithful in that role, what God can do through it.
It's amazing to think that Daniel, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Haggai were all first, second, third, fourth generation refugees. And yet God powerfully used them to further his kingdom. I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions of Jonathan in a minute, but I wonder what gets you out of bed in the morning. What is it for you that what has God made you to be? He might have made you to be a teacher, or a doctor, or a mum, or a husband, or a wife, or a nurse. What has God made you to be? Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, I think, says, for we are what he has made us, which I think is a beautiful phrase. And one of the ways you work out what you're made to be is by asking, what gets me out of the bed in the morning? What is it I really want to do? Do you want to sing? Do you want to lead young people? Do you want to teach? Do you want to make a difference in a refugee camp? Do you want to see your neighborhood transformed? I remember a friend became a Christian called Mitzi in Bournemouth. And she had the biggest mouth that you'd ever seen. She swore like a trooper. And she got converted. And about 3 or 4 months after she got converted, my wife and I said to her, Mitzi, what does God want you to do with your life? She lived in a social housing scheme. And she said, God wants me to see every single person in this close converted. So I smiled, the pastoral smile, and said, that's nice. Thinking in my head, you're off your trolley, it'll never happen. It did happen. She didn't give up on what God had made her to do. So as I asked Jonathan that question, what's God made you to do? What is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? What's the thing that you can do with your life that could be the most beautiful and fulfilling thing for you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? Apart from an alarm.
Yeah, that's right. And the kids. I've always had it may sound strange and slightly morbid, but I really see my life looking at it backwards
often. And I make decisions based on what will I not regret. And so when I look at the opportunities in front of me, some of them may be risks. I think God has made me as to be a risk taker in life.
I know somebody wrote a really good book about that.
Yeah, that's right. Cue.
Ta-da!
Yeah, and I feel like that it's my and I may not succeed at any of them, but I believe that God has put inside of me a desire to try different ideas, think differently. To the Apple video this morning.
So the mission thing, I want to come back to where we began and then open us up for questions. I'm so excited about tonight and about this conversation and the potential that it has. We began our conversation by you saying that we're reaching less and less of a percentage of the world. And yet, the places that are the most unreached are also the places where there is the greatest opportunity for professional people to go and to be engaged and to serve. I know we've talked previously about this idea that we mustn't replace one set of tiers, the ordained and non-ordained, the lay and the clergy, with another set of tiers, i.e. if you've got a profession, then God can really use you, and if you haven't, then he can't. I think that would be a disaster. But nevertheless, there is this opportunity, isn't there, for the body of Christ under the radar to reach the places that we're just not reaching at the moment. What can we do in response to that opportunity as one church and as individual Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think what you've highlighted is the absolutely critical role of the church moving forward. You know, one of the things that you asked me earlier on, you asked the question, what do you think might go wrong? Or what are you most concerned about? Yeah. And I think when we think about the bigger picture, you know, and we think, if we could mobilize 1% of adult evangelicals in the U.S. today, we would double the entire missionary force globally, across all denominations, all organizations, Catholic, wow, Protestant, everything. Wow. 1%. So if 1 out of 100 adult evangelicals today in America, and we could take the statistics into Europe, but said, I will take who God has created me to be overseas for the glory and the purposes of God, we will double our missionary workforce. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, going, surely that's possible. That's incredible. Surely in our lifetime that's possible. With the access to travel and information and the internet and everything that God has given to our generation, that's possible today. Now, when I look at that, I say, but we don't just want to increase the number of Christian expats around the world. No. There's over 20 million Christian expats serving around the world today, from places like South Korea and America, and so many from Latin America. And so how do we engage people's hearts and minds? Not just get them going, but help them understand that this represents an unprecedented opportunity in history. No one else has had the opportunity to do this on this scale. And so that's where the role of the church in beginning to disciple itself into this way of thinking, as you said earlier, beginning to live out the idea of being fully present where God has them each and every week, and simply asking God, what have you shown me in your word today? What does that mean for this next week? What am I going to do in obedience to what you've shown me? And then holding each other accountable for that.
But the beauty of what you've just said is that it makes the task of reaching the world possible. It takes it from the level of this great dream that we're all committed to and aspiring to, and turns it into the possible. And the possible is, today where I am, I will live for Christ. And I can make a difference. It doesn't matter about my failures. It doesn't matter that I don't have a Rev or PhD before or after my name. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I love Jesus and that I recognize that my life is his gift to me. And in the words of the American poet Maya Angelou, what I do with it is my gift back. So how are we going to make that gift back, I guess? I wonder if tonight God is stirring in many of us a sense of call. And that call might be to bed into where we are. That call might be to take the professional experience that we have and go somewhere else. It might be to take our student education and to take a bold step. It might be to put a university degree on hold and go and work in a Greek island. But what is God asking you to do as you listen to what's being said tonight? How can you serve the purposes of God in your life? Because in the end, that's the only thing that you're accountable for personally. Your decisions and what you do with your time and with your gifts. And the time is short. And I don't understand how a Christian could say no to anything that you've said. Has anybody got questions that you'd like to ask Jonathan that you've been thinking about? I'm going to look and see. Oh, there are some here. So is there anybody got a question that you'd like to ask? If you have, just pop your hand up and we'll get somebody. Lee, could you shout? Because I can't be bothered running up to the balcony to be blunt.
On the way home from...
Don't drop Pippa over the balcony, please.
On the way home from work a few weeks ago, as I was coming from Amersham, I looked across the open fields and God reminded me through the picture that the harvest is plentiful. Well, what does that actually mean for us here in South Bucks? And supplementary question for that, in that is, why are we not seeing the harvest brought into the store, the harvest brought into the storehouse?
Can you answer the South Bucks question, do you think? Or do you think somebody from South Bucks needs to answer the South Bucks question?
I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm not from South Bucks. I live in it, but I'm not from it. Does somebody else have an answer to that question? Yes, of course. So the question, there were two. It felt like question time. There was a question and a supplementary question time, so I let him away with it. And the first one was, he was on his way back from somewhere, and the Lord reminded him that the fields were white unto harvest, that the harvest was plentiful. What does the harvest look like? And the second question was, why are we not seeing it brought into the storehouse in South Bucks? Do you want to answer either of those?
I would say, I wonder how much of it goes back to, again, to this idea of, when we look at Ephesians, we see that the laity, the pastors and the teachers were put into roles where they were given the task of equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry. And instead, what we've seen so often in the church is that these are the ones actually doing the ministry rather than equip. And so we've created this space where the average person who's actually rubbing shoulders, who's spending 40 to 60 hours a week with these people on a daily basis, doesn't see their role as critical, as mission critical. Just thinking of a story, we have a very close colleague of ours who spent 11 years working with, her and her husband were engineers in a very closed access country. And she says now, and she says this with tears in her eyes, she says, it wasn't until year 10. She said, every day my husband and I would come home from work and we would pray and we'd say, God, why are we not seeing breakthroughs? Why are we not seeing people, why are we not seeing relationships built with local people? And they would come home and pray for ministry and go out on the streets looking for work to be done. And she said, only in the last year we were there did we realize that actually every day we were out and God had us there to be excellent engineers, but through that to shine his life and his love. And I can't help but believe that where we practice that, where we put that into practice, we will see things happen. Maybe not on huge scales, but that God will honor that.
So I think, Lee, that the harvest looks like transformed lives. It looks like us connecting with people where they are and taking every opportunity to do good and to speak out the name of Christ. This morning at Gold Hill, we explained our new mission paradigm for everything we are and everything we do. It involves 4 things. The proclamation of God's word, the truth that Jesus died and rose from the dead, and that he died for our sins. Living with and being the presence of God to the poor and those that are outside of the kingdom. Intentionally recognizing that when you go to school tomorrow to teach, in your biology class, you are the presence of Christ. And that somehow the harvest is the students around you. As you are the best teacher you can be, that will garner its own fruit. Also, that we can speak up for those, a harvest of righteousness, where we make goodness fashionable again, and we speak up against injustice, and we speak out against those things that are holding people in places of ostracism or marginalization. And lastly, we pray. We get on our knees and say, God, this nation can be changed, but only through your power. And if we as individual Christians can hold on to those things, then we'll see the harvest in front of us. Why is it not happening in South Bucks? I was being facetious. I've now been here 7 years. I've said this a number of occasions, and I think sometimes people get a little bit offended about what I'm about to say. I love living in this community, but I never want to be like it. I love leading this church. I never want to be like it. I think we are too comfortable. I think we've allowed our Christianity to revolve around us. I think we measure whether we've met with God according to whether he's made us feel good and whether we've encountered blessing. And we have forgotten the missional aspect of God, which is we are called to go. We are blessed to be a blessing. And it shouldn't be either or. I believe passionately that this church should be full of people that have been healed, restored, renewed, transformed, encountering the presence of the Holy Spirit, baptized in him, immersed in his power. But if it stops at the door, that's why we're not seeing the harvest. Because we are obsessed with meetings, and we're obsessed with enjoying ourselves in church, and we then also define to God what his harvest would look like. We want it to be a harvest that is of white middle-class people that will fit perfectly in with our plans for church. And he says, on your bike. If you want to see a harvest, it's a harvest. And I think that there are lots of other reasons, but those are some of them. What do you do to help people who want to learn a language? This is a question for a context into which they're going. Do you do anything?
Yeah, great question. So we're working on a couple of different fronts. One, we're working with actually with a couple of language schools who've been teaching for a number of decades in the region that we're focusing on, and they're seeing their numbers going down. In fact, one of them is just struggling to survive. And so we're looking at, can we take the teachers, many of these are national teachers who have worked for 20 years as teachers teaching missionaries in the region, but can we take what they're doing and put it into a format that works for someone who's en route to coming? So potentially before they land, as they're landing, and then after they land on the ground as well.
Somebody's asked what was the verse from Colossians. It was Colossians 3. Verse 23 and following. There are several questions. Some of them are quite simple. What would you say to a young person or to young people thinking of going to Bible college or to study with something like YWAM rather than secular vocational university or a quote-unquote real job in the world?
Yeah, good.
The quotes were in the quote. I didn't put the quote in.
I would say God will continue to call people from his church to be involved in teaching, preaching, training, equipping. And if that is something that God has uniquely gifted you and given you a passion to do, go and do it with all your heart.
Absolutely.
And be the best theologian, be the best apologist, be the best preacher that this country has ever seen. And do it unapologetically. where we are, where I would say, we find a lot of young people who are moving in that direction because they believe that they have a sense in their hearts that God is saying, I want all of you.
So they're doing what you did when you went.
They were doing what I did. And I'm saying to them, stop, hold on. Why do you believe that going into ministry is the correct response for your life? Is it because of what you've been told? Is it your perception of what it means to serve God, or is it truly something that God has placed inside of you?
Very good, very good. And I was talking to Ruth Giesner today. Ruth is an older member of our church, a fantastic champion for mission, at our barbecue with our mission partners. And she said to me, Malcolm, I've really enjoyed today's focus on mission, and it's been done really well. She was really grateful. And she said, and in all of this, there is still a reality that when All Nations, for example, talks to, All Nations is a college that equips people for ministry and mission, when it talks to churches and countries around the world and says, what do you need most? There's still a dearth of people that have a depth of understanding of the Bible to teach people how to live well. And they're still crying out for that. There's a really interesting question here, if I can get this phone to turn on. There it is. Oh, no, there it is. So this is, one person has sent 2 questions. What would be your advice for the emerging generation as they make their way into professional life while trying to live a life of mission? And the second question from that person is, what technology do you think we are utilizing the least that we could do more with to reach those who don't know Christ?
Repeat the first question again.
What do you say to young professionals that are emerging into their careers and are seeking to do so missionally? How do they hold the balance?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Do you think that perhaps the whole point of what you've been saying is that it's a dichotomy that is wrong? That your professional life is an act of worship, and if you put Jesus at the center of it, automatically it will change your priorities? Or is that too simplistic?
I think there's still often the thinking that I do my work in order to have opportunities for real ministry, even in my workplace. And when we look at the tent-making movement, for example, of the 70s and 80s, and there was a really big push towards tent-making, there were a lot of pretty scathing critiques written about tent-making after that time. And if you read through some of the stories, what you'll see is this common theme of people who were putting in 50, 60, 70 hours a week in their job and then going off and trying to do ministry. Rather than recognizing that work itself, as you just said, is an act of worship, and that as I do my job fully and truly to the glory of God, I will reflect His glory. I will invite conversation. I will invite questions. It doesn't take away the need for proclamation in any way, but as I do that first and foremost, because that is who I am created to be, God will use that in completely unexpected ways, and people will come to me asking me for a reason for the hope that lies within me.
So before you answer the second question, there's another question that ties into that, I think. Presuming that it is not appropriate to talk about Jesus in the workplace, especially in Islamic countries, how effective is this approach in reality? Yes. Is it a case of it being better than nothing?
Great. Yeah, I think this is a really big misconception. As we're connecting with people who are living this out day in and day out and have done so for decades, in some of the most challenging and extreme areas of the world, they will tell you again and again that they have opportunities on a weekly basis to share their life and faith with their colleagues. Again, as they work with excellence, they become of such value to the company that they're seen to be not untouchable, but in many cases their employer will do everything they can to hold on to them. And so even in the most extreme Islamic contexts, all of our people, and this is not just in our groups, but at groups, other organizations, other groups that are out there, when done sensitively.
I'm reading text and messages at the same time.
When done sensitively
and listening to you.
And culturally appropriately, the opportunities to share your faith. In fact, almost without exception, we'll be told by people who are living this out that they have many more opportunities to share their faith, many more than they would in a Western context, where faith is something private, something to be kept to yourself. In many of these places, you're expected to be a Christian. If you're an American or a Westerner, you speak English, you're expected to be a Christian. But they don't see you acting like the Christian that they've seen on television. For them, Kardashian and Christian often go side by side. And so you come in and you're living your life in a very different, with a very different lifestyle, hopefully. And so you automatically invite question, you invite interest. And so actually, what we're finding is exactly the opposite. There's and especially with ISIS and what's happening globally, there's a real interest.
I'm aware of time, but I just want to try and get through these. Thank you so much for all these questions. You're clearly really engaging with us, whether you're online or here. I have no idea who you are, but thanks very much anyway. This is a linked question. I think you've answered it. How can we break away from the non-conformist view that we work only to raise money to give to the church, rather than viewing work as a mission? How do we break away from a church culture? I think at least in part, the pastors of churches have a responsibility to play there. And that's by making sure that we remind you that your lives matter. And that we're not more important than you because we have 3 letters at the beginning of our name or a whole list of letters after our name. That actually mission is something that we're in together, and we celebrate your work rather than turning it into a place where you identify and target people like target practice to get them into the kingdom. You live your life for the glory of God, and God can use that very powerfully. Is there anything, do you want to add something to that? And this, I don't know what this question is. How do you help people become, I've got that one. How do you train people to relate to local people within a new culture? So do you offer support to people when they're relocating from one culture to another?
So part of the vision of Scatter Global is not to go off and create another organization. In fact, we're not an organization. We see ourselves as a service provider and a hub where people can come to access job opportunities, resources, and tools. And so what we're trying to do and what we're working on with other organizations is pulling in other groups who've done a much better job, who've honed some of these tools over the years. And as people are going, again, en route, we're saying, would you consider accessing tools from these organizations to help you think through cultural issues, landing a family cross-culturally, some of the member care, and the training that's necessary.
And you're going to be available after our service tonight for people to have a chat with you and to talk to you, ask you some questions?
Yes.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, could you show your appreciation to Jonathan Thiessen, please? Thanks, Johnny. This is a really important evening. It's an important evening because we're being reminded that our lives matter to God and the choices that we make are deeply important. Who we marry, where we live, how we bring up our children, what we do and get paid for is not just about what's best for us. It's about what's best for Jesus Christ and for his kingdom. And those questions are so important, and yet they so often don't get asked. Ask them tonight. And if God is prompting in you a sense of deeper passion and energy for what he's called you to, then give yourself to it with all your heart. If he's calling you into a new space, then don't be afraid to follow it. And if he's saying something to you, let it bed into your heart. Let it brood over you. Let it form your choices of university degree or university or what you do with your children or how you bring them up. Whatever age you are, 50, 40, 30, 20, may God guide us.